One patch of that pond never froze. Every January, the whole 3 acres locked up hard enough to walk a tractor across. Every part of it but one spot near the north edge, about the size of a kitchen table, black water in a white field. All winter, every winter, on the coldest mornings you could see a thread of steam coming off it, thin as breath, while the rest of the county sat under 6 inches of ice. Nobody in Halloran County ever thought twice about it. Ponds do odd things. There was always a reason not to wonder, cattle to feed, a fence down somewhere, a winter to get through. Vernon Tice had been not wondering about it for 30 years. Then, in the driest August anybody could remember, at 72 years old, he rented a pump and started emptying that pond onto the dirt. It had not rained since May. Every stock pond in the valley was a cracked bowl. Wells were coughing air. Men were hauling water in tanks 40 miles a day to keep cattle standing. And there was Vernon, a widower who mostly kept to himself, running a pump the wrong direction, pulling the last water for miles out of the ground and sending it down a dry draw to waste. They came out to the fence to watch him do it. "He's finally lost it," somebody said at the fence, not bothering to lower his voice. "Old Vernon's draining the only water left in the county, in a drought. You watching this?" They were all watching it. And every one of them thought the same thing, the way people do when an old man does something that makes no sense. That grief and age had caught up with him at last, which was not an unreasonable thing to think. Vernon's wife Ada had died 2 years earlier in February, and he had handled it the way men of that generation in that country handle it, by not handling it at all, in public ever. He kept the place. He came to the co-op. He said the appropriate number of words to people, and then went home. If you had asked anybody in that valley to bet on whether Vernon Tice was doing fine, they would not have taken the bet. So a man like that, draining a full pond in August, reads a certain way. Not one of them asked the only question that mattered. Why would a man who had farmed that ground for 50 years drain the one pond that never went dry? Because that was the thing Vernon had noticed, and nobody else had. And he had noticed it the slow way, by being there for 50 years and paying attention. Every ranch in that valley had a stock pond. In a normal year they all behaved the same. Full in spring, low by fall, cracked mud in a drought. All except his. His pond dropped in dry years, but it never emptied. In the drought of the 80s, when the whole county was hauling water, Vernon's pond had gone low and then simply stopped going lower, and held there all summer while everybody else's died. He had told himself for 30 years that he was lucky with runoff. This year had taken that explanation away from him. There had been no runoff, because there had been no rain, not a real one since May, and his pond had barely moved. Something was putting water into it that was not coming from the sky. Once he let himself think that the other thing came straight back to him, the one he had been looking at every winter of his life, and filing away as one of those odd things. Ice forms on still water when the cold gets into it. It forms evenly, across the whole surface, unless something is stirring the water or warming it. And there was one spot on Vernon's pond, always the same spot, near the north edge, that would not freeze in January. Water coming up from deep underground carries a little warmth with it, not much. Enough to keep a patch of ice from setting. He sat with that a while. A pond that would not die in a drought, and a patch that would not freeze in a January, in the same corner of the same 3 acres. That was not 2 odd things. That was 2 different symptoms pointing at the same cause. There was water pushing up into his pond from below, and it had been doing it his entire life, quietly, under a few feet of silt and everybody's assumptions. He was 72. That is the part that decided it, and he has said so since. A younger man would have thought about it for another few years, or waited for a wetter season, or asked somebody's opinion and been talked out of it. A younger man has the luxury of a next time. Vernon did the arithmetic that men his age do without meaning to. If he was going to find out what was under that pond, it was not going to be next year or the year after. And it was certainly not going to be by somebody else after he was gone, because nobody else had noticed anything worth investigating. He rented the pump on a Monday. Tell me where you're watching from. Comments below. I read every single one. And if you have ever noticed something for years without ever once asking why, stay with me, because that is really what this is about. Draining it was the easy part. Finding out what was under it, alone at 72 in August, was the work. The pump ran for 11 days. As the water dropped, the pond gave up the usual things a pond gives up. A sunk fence post, a rusted bucket, the frame of a hayrake somebody had lost before Vernon was born, a tire. The men stopped coming to the fence after the third day. There is only so long you can watch an old man empty a hole. By the second week it was a bowl of grey mud, with a shallow pool left in the middle. And Vernon walked out into it with a shovel in the heat, sinking to his boot tops, heading for the north corner where the ice never formed. Mud is heavier than people think. A shovel of wet pond silt is 30 pounds, and it does not want to leave the shovel. He worked mornings only, because afternoons in that August were not survivable for a man of 72 doing that. And even mornings, he stopped twice an hour and stood there breathing with his hands on his knees. His nephew came out on the fourth day and asked, carefully, whether he was all right, which Vernon understood to mean, "Are you losing your mind? And should somebody be doing something about that?" "I'm fine," Vernon said, and kept digging. He dug down 2 feet and found wet. Not damp. Wet, saturated, and getting colder as he went, in the middle of the worst drought of his life, in ground that had been drying under an August sun for a week and a half. That is not how mud behaves. Mud dries from the top down. This was doing the opposite of what mud does. Everything under there was still full of water, and it was not draining away. He kept going. At about 6 feet his shovel came down on something that was not mud, and it rang. He cleared around it with his hands, because at that point a shovel is a liability. What came up out of the silt was stone, cut stone, fitted stone, a rough ring of fieldstone about the size of a wagon wheel, set carefully edge to edge without mortar, buried under 6 feet of pond bottom. Vernon sat back in the mud and looked at it for a long while. Somebody had built something there, long before him, before the dam that made the pond, before his own father, possibly before the county had a name worth writing down. Somebody had found this exact spot and thought it was worth hauling stone to and fitting by hand. You do not do that for a low place in a pasture. You do that for water. The old-timers built stone around a good spring to keep the stock out and the silt down. That is what he was kneeling in. A spring house, drowned and forgotten, buried under 50 years of pond. The middle of the ring was packed solid with silt. Vernon started pulling it out by the handful. He was 2 feet down into the throat of it, both arms in the mud past the elbow, when the mud pushed back. Water came up through the hole, not seeping, rising, pushing up past his forearms, cold enough to make him pull his hands out, clear where everything around it was brown. It filled the stone ring while he watched, and ran over the lip, and kept coming. Steady as a tap, nobody was ever going to turn off. He sat back in the mud of his own drained pond, 72 years old, filthy to the shoulders, and laughed out loud. He has said since that it was the first time he had laughed since Ada died, and that he was glad there was nobody there to see it, because he would not have been able to explain it to them. It was not a geyser. He has always been honest about that, when people wanted the story bigger than it was. It did not shoot into the air. It was a good, strong, flowing spring, coming up under its own pressure from somewhere a long way down, the way it had been coming up all along, held back by nothing but the silt he had just pulled out with his hands. The county brought a hydrologist out, because Vernon called and asked, which is a thing men his age do not always do. She told him what he already half knew. Deep under that ground is a layer of water-bearing rock pinned between 2 layers that water cannot get through. Rain falls on high ground miles away, soaks into that layer, and gets trapped, squeezed between the rock above and the rock below. Pressure builds, and where the ground opens a crack low enough, the water does not seep. It comes up on its own, and keeps coming, without a pump, without power, without anybody asking it to. They call it artesian. The old-timers just called that ground lucky and built stone around it. Because it comes from deep, confined ground, a spring like that does not much care what the weather did this summer. The shallow wells that were failing all over that county were drinking from what had rained lately. Vernon Spring was drinking from what rained on a hillside a long time before he was born. She was careful about what she would and would not say, and Vernon respected that. She measured the flow and told him it was enough to water a great many cattle every day, indefinitely, as far as anybody could tell. Then she told him the part people leave out. It is not infinite. An artesian source has a pressure head, and that head can drop if too many wells are drilled into the same formation, if the recharge area gets paved or drained, if somebody upstream in the system takes more than it can give. There are places in this country where flowing artesian wells stopped flowing inside a generation because of exactly that. So don't sell water, she said, and don't let anybody talk you into a bigger pipe than you need. Vernon wrote that down, which she said afterward almost nobody does. They came back to the fence eventually, not to laugh this time. By September, the drought had broken exactly nobody's way, and the hauling had got desperate. Diesel and hours and cattle going thin, while men trucked water in from town at a price that went up every week. And there was Vernon Tice's place, with a pipe running from a stone ring to a stock tank, cold, clean water going in by gravity, and a patch of green around the overflow in a country that had gone the color of a paper bag. Del Barrow was first up the drive, and it cost him something to come, because he had been the loudest man at that fence in August. Vernon, my tank's dry and my cattle are. He stopped and started again. I'm in a bad way. Vernon looked at the man who had narrated his supposed senility to the whole county a month before. Then he looked at the water running clean and endless out of ground that everybody had been driving past their whole lives. Bring 'em over, he said. There's more coming up than I'll ever use. No sense watching your cows go thin 60 feet from all this. That autumn, Vernon Tice's spring watered better than half the cattle in the low end of that county. He never charged for it, which some people could not understand, and others understood completely. Men who had laughed hauled their thirsty stock to his place and filled their tanks and went home ashamed and grateful in about equal measure. Vernon let them, and mostly did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the water was not already saying for him. Del Barrow never said thank you. I want to be accurate about that, because it would be a tidier story if he had. What he did instead, 3 weeks after the rains came back, was show up at Vernon's place at 7 in the morning with a post driver in the bed of his truck and start replacing the worst 40 rods of Vernon's boundary fence. He did not ask. He did not announce it. He worked until about 2, and when Vernon came down with a thermos, Del said something about the wire being older than both of them. And that was the whole conversation. Then he came back the following Saturday and did another stretch. He did that on and off for 2 years, and at some point in there, it stopped being about the water and became the thing it actually was, which is that 2 men who had lived 4 miles apart for 40 years and never had a reason to spend a day together had finally been given one. Vernon's take on it, years later, was about as much as he was ever going to say on the subject. Del's not a man who apologizes. He's a man who fixes your fence. When the rains finally came back, nobody needed his spring anymore, but something had shifted and it stayed shifted. The man who had kept to himself since his wife passed had a yard with trucks in it again, men who owed him and knew it, and came around now for the fencing and the haying, and to sit on his porch a while, the way they should have been doing for 2 years. The spring gave him water. It also, at 72, gave him his neighbor's back. He would tell you the second one was worth more, and he would be telling the truth. That winter he rebuilt the stonework, fitting the old fieldstone back the way whoever came before him had set it. He never learned their name. Some homesteader, generations back, who had found flowing water, built stone around it to keep it clean, used it. And then the dam came, and the silt came, and the forgetting came, and it went under for 50 years. Vernon figured he owed that person something, so he set the stones right and left the spring open and running for whoever came after him to find already working. Nobody made that water, he told his nephew, who was helping him set the last one. It was down there pushing up the whole time, through the drought in the 80s, Through the year your aunt died. Through every single day those boys were hauling water past my gate. He set the stone and pressed the mud in around it. All I ever did was get the mud off it. Vernon Tice is 77 now. The spring runs the way it ran when there was nobody here to name it. And every January, when the new pond freezes over hard enough to walk on, there is still one patch near the north edge that will not take the ice. Black water in a white field, a thread of steam coming off it on the coldest mornings, the same as it looked the winter he was 20 and 40 and 70. The only thing that ever changed is that now there is an old man who walks out to look at it.